Thank you, Mr. Glasgow. I think you were about to deal with the fifth example.
So yes, I was. If it helps to give an idea of timetable for this afternoon, what I'd like to try to do is to finish the remaining 3 example DDOs before a short break, and then we can turn to deal with some of the contemporaneous complaints and their investigation. Thereafter, when I come to deal in particular with Operation Northmoor and the RMP investigation into the allegations, it may be that I'll ask to deal with that tomorrow, so that everyone can be present to hear it. Turning then to the 5th example from the DDOs that we've selected for the purpose of the opening statement, again, to give it the operation and objective title that's been provided in the documentation, it is Operation C1, Objective 9, and took place on the 12th of March of 2011. And as before, can I set out those terms of reference which this DDO has the potential to engage? First, of course, the core participant, Haji Shafiqullah, claims to have lost relatives as a consequence of the alleged unlawful activity by British armed forces during this operation. There were concerns expressed about this deliberate detention operation within the armed forces. The deliberate detention operation was the subject of a report provided to Command ISAF by an international organisation. There were concerns expressed, and this was part of the BBC Panorama programme of July 2022, and it was investigated as part of Operation Northmoor by the Royal Military Police. On the 12th of March of 2011, a UK Special Forces subunit commanded by N1141 conducted a nighttime DDO in Konano, a small village in the Sangin district of Northern Helmand. The target of that operation was a suspected Taliban commander who for these purposes has been given the objective name number 9. According to the intelligence that had been provided, he was an experienced and committed commander who was the focal point in the area for insurgent disruption. Can I immediately invite attention to the screens and in particular to document 28, and within that document can we look at page 11. Page 11 provides the ISAF and NATO documentation with which we are now familiar. We've seen a number of these examples before. It is difficult to read, and I apologise for that. It's the best copy that we could produce. But if we look at it together, Objective 9 is an experienced commander, subordinate and trusted associate of an unnamed individual there. He has recently asserted his allegiance to the Taliban. He is their representative and focal point in the area for insurgent disruption through the murder and intimidation of its supporters and participants. Objective 9 remains a committed, irreconcilable Taliban commander in the area and is subordinate to the Shadow District Governor. If we leave that to one side for a moment, since that deals simply with the intelligence that led to the targeting of the operation and Objective 9, can I turn to deal with the details of the operation, and we'll look back again within document 28 to other bits of information. During the course of the operation, 8 individuals were killed, each of whom is a relative of Haji Shafiqullah, who was aged 9 at the time of the DDO. Asadullah, who was Haji Shafiqullah's second cousin, Saifullah, who was also his second cousin, Zaibullah, who was his paternal uncle, Khalilullah, who was also his paternal uncle, Nakibullah, who was his father's cousin, Ismailullah, who was his father, who was the target of the deliberate detention operation, Ashaqullah, who was his paternal uncle, and Mohammedullah, who was also his paternal uncle. According to the available evidence from UK Special Forces, the statements that were taken from them, and the supporting documentation, the following picture emerges of what took place during the DDO. A cordon was set around the first compound, and initially the Afghan partner unit led the call out, but it went unanswered. But eventually an elder left and directed others to do the same. One of the males was escorted back inside to assist with the clearance, but as he did so, he ran off into the building. Members of the call sign followed him and found him armed with a weapon, and he then attempted to engage members of the call sign with it. He was immediately engaged with aimed shots that resulted in his death, and therefore termed 1 EKIA. The call sign continued with the clearance and came across another male armed with an AK-47 who moved to fire at them. He, as before, was engaged with aimed shots that resulted in his death and the second EKIA. The call sign then moved to the second compound, where the Afghan partner unit led the next call-out. 5 males, 3 women and 7 children left the building. 2 of the males were sent back inside, but moved into firing positions and attempted to engage the call sign with an AK-47. Both were engaged themselves with aimed shots that resulted in their deaths, and 2 more EKIA. A further male grasped the downed AK-47 and moved to engage the call sign. He too was engaged with aimed shots, which resulted in his death and another EKIA. The call sign moved into the compound and was then confronted by a further male who moved from behind a door and drew his weapon. He too was engaged with aimed shots that resulted in his death and another EKIA. Whilst clearing the compound, a male emerged and engaged the call sign with a burst of AK-47 fire. He was engaged with aimed shots that led to his death and another EKIA. A second male used that situation as a distraction and an opportunity to pick up a grenade which he prepared to throw at members of the call sign. He was engaged with aimed shots that resulted in his death and another EKIA. The grenade he had hold of then detonated. One of the elders who had been detained, having left the compound, identified one of those who had been killed as Objective 9, the target of the operation. Can we turn back in document 28, please, to look to pages 5 through to 8, which deal with some of the details that I have just recounted to you. We're looking at the OPSUM, which is for Operation C1 and Objective 9. And if we scroll down on this page, we can see that Section 5, headed Summary of Incident, that details the events that took place during the course of the DDO. And at the very last entry, we can see on this page that a cordon was set around the first compound. If we then turn over, please, we can see the similar details to those which I have just recounted. The APU-led call-out was commenced on the compound, no response, and the call-out was repeated. An Elder Bravo exits the main building of the red compound and is sent back in to collect all the E's and K's. That's women and children. We then look down a few entries. 1 Bravo is escorted into the main building to assist with the clearance. After entering the 3rd room, he runs off. As the call sign move into the next room, the B is armed with a weapon and attempts to engage the call sign. He poses an immediate threat to life and is engaged with aimed shots, resulting in 1 EKIA. The Bravo's pistol is recovered. And continuing, the call sign continues with the clearance of the compound. As they enter a room of the internally attached guest house, they encounter a Bravo armed with an AK-47 who moves to fire at them. He poses an immediate threat and is engaged with aimed shots, resulting in 1 EKIA. Then moving down to the next compound, one can see that the APU-led call-out on the following compound begins. There is no reply to the call-out, so entry was made and the subunit moved into the courtyard. The call-out continues, and eventually, as we can see at the bottom of the page, if we can scroll down slightly, we see 5 Bs, 3 Es and 7 Ks exit the building. 5 male, 3 women and 7 children. 2 males are sent back to pull down the curtains and open the doors. As they enter the building, they move into fire positions and attempt to engage the call signs in the courtyard with 1 AK-47. They pose an immediate threat and are engaged by the laddermen covering the courtyard, resulting in 2 EKIA. A further male, previously squatting by the building and ignoring the call-out, immediately grasps the downed AK-47 and moves to engage the call signs in the courtyard. He poses an immediate threat and is engaged with aimed shots by one of the call signs in close proximity, resulting in 1 EKIA. The call signs move into compound, and on entry they are confronted by a further male. He moves from behind a door and draws his weapon. He is engaged by the lead call sign, resulting in 1 EKIA. And then over to the next page, please. The lead call sign commences clearance of the compound, and as they do so, one male emerges from a room ahead of the call sign. As they enter the room, the male engages with a burst of AK-47 fire. He poses an immediate threat to life and is engaged with aimed shots, resulting in 1 EKIA. A second male uses the distraction as an opportunity and picks up a grenade and prepares to throw it at the call sign. He is about to release the grenade when he is engaged, resulting in 1 EKIA. The call signs take cover and the grenade then detonates. As part of the SSE of the compound complex, a total of 4 AK-47 assault rifles with various rounds, a pistol with 5 rounds, and a grenade were recovered. If we look in the document that I've just referred to, that's document 28, and scroll down if we can to page 9, please. If we look a little further down, please, for the moment. We can see detailed there the SSE results. So we have 1 AK-47, 1 pistol, 5 rounds, 2 AK-47s, and then a further AK-47 and the remnants of the destroyed grenade. If we scroll a little further down that page, please, for a moment, we'll be able to see, maybe onto the next page, I do apologise. If we look, please, to the OC's comments, so the Officer Commanding's comments in section 29, it was described by him on review of the material, this was a successful operation that involved a considerable amount of target development. Using the information that has been gleaned from the available documentation, the events of the night, just as with the other DDOs, have been put into a simple presentation that highlights what may be the potentially relevant information to which I have just referred. Can I invite everyone, please, to look to the screen, and what we'll do, if we may, is consider the slideshow presentation for example 5, Objective 9. It provides the same information as before, namely the type of operation, the date, the core participant's name, and where this has featured. Can I invite that we turn straight, please, to page 2 of the document? And we have the 2 maps that, sir, you are now familiar with set out on the right-hand side. An overview map providing the location of the target and the DDO operation, as we can see there, northwest of Kandahar. And then below, somewhat zoomed in, we can see that we're dealing with an area that lies directly north of Gereshk. Over the page, if we can, please. The same information that I have just taken you through in the original documentation is copied into here. I will not read it again, but I will simply identify that 2 particular paragraphs have been identified within this page. Both relate to the circumstances of someone being killed, both described as an EKIA, and in particular the first one, the use of a particular TTP which saw a male being taken back into the building in order to assist with the search, whereupon he armed himself. If we turn over the page, similar information provided again on the next page coming from the operational summary. We can see the details in which the TTP of sending someone back in to clear the compound has been identified, and the circumstances in which individuals came to lose their lives. Again, having taken you through it, sir, I don't propose to rehearse exactly the same information again, but it's there for completeness so that everyone has got it. Can I turn on to the final page? we have here the information, the information that's provided here, namely the results, thank you very much indeed, namely the results of the SSE, the sensitive site exploitation. 8 EKIA, 9 detainees, 4 AK-47s, 1 pistol with 5 rounds, the destroyed grenade, so the remnants of it, and documentation that was seized, all of which considered relevant by those who conducted the search in the aftermath of the 9 people who had been killed. Can we leave that document to one side now, please, for the moment? The contemporaneous documents make clear that lethal force was said to have been used by the members of the subunit in self-defence. In other words, that the deceased were shot and killed because they posed an immediate threat to the lives of one or more members of the UK Special Forces subunit who were present, and that everything done by the members of that subunit was done in accordance with the rules of engagement and the applicable law of armed conflict. However, the operational summary records something in the desired effect which may be of relevance. Can I invite attention in document 28, please, back to page 9. There is a section in the numbered boxes alongside number 17, which bears the title Effect Desired. And whilst there may be a typo by whoever has filled this entry in, it was clearly meant to read the death or capture of Objective 9 would directly impede the threat. The use of the words death in that particular desired effect section may be at odds with the type of incident which was said to have been carried out that evening, namely a deliberate detention operation. And the inquiry will consider these different accounts with care and compare these documents with the accounts that are given of the events that evening, and in particular the accounts of the relatives of those who lost their lives. The family insists that all of the deceased were innocent civilians. It is claimed that 2 of them were found shot with their hands still bound in plasticuffs, that several of them were found in the room where they would have been going to sleep, and that each of them appeared to have been killed when they were either lying or sitting down. When the operational summary was provided to the chain of command, concerns were expressed about what had happened. Can I invite attention, please, to document number 29, and within the body of that document to page 4. In an email sent by N2107 to N1791, providing the operational summary, the following description was given: back to the good old tactics. The reply to that email, so from N1791, appears a little further up the page. At least there was one Bravo who actually fired at the subunit. However you look at it, that is still a lot of EKIA for the number of weapons that are reported. I suspect they were wearing green jackets. N2107 replied to that email. In Afghanistan, the various individuals are more sporting and appear keen to engage in a quick draw challenge once the subunit has made entry into the Alpha. The inquiry will consider these exchanges and the context in which they were made with care. Concerns were also raised by the same international organisation in May of 2011 about the way in which this and the previously described DDO had been conducted. At a meeting that month, the the organisation clarified that they were concerned that using one of the occupants to assist with the compound clearance might allow the person to be directed to pick up a weapon and therefore manufacture a self-defence scenario. In July 2011, a report was served on ISAF Command that identified the potential danger posed by the house clearance practice of using occupants who had left the compound to go back inside to assist with the search. That particular report was sent by N6881 to J35 campaigns at the UK Special Forces headquarters. In the exchange of emails and that report, reference was made to a review having been undertaken of the search method. And I don't need to take you to it, but to repeat another email which I've already made reference to. N2108 sent an email to N2272 in which he said, "I have spoken to N6881, who has suggested that we respond in terms of the fact that we have reviewed the TTP and are now content with it." In August 2011, N2108 advised that the international organisation should be written to and advised that in light of the comprehensive review that had been undertaken, no further clarity would be provided about the TTP. That comprehensive review had been carried out in April of 2011. And the commander of UK Special Forces at the headquarters in Afghanistan have reached the conclusion that I have already taken you to, but can I do so again to document 32, please, and within document 32 in particular to page 11. Whilst we're waiting for the technology to keep up, beyond one more page, it may be that I can't add beyond 10, so it may be that it's 12 and not 11. There we go, thank you very much. The conclusion reached following that review is set out in paragraph 14. The TTP in question has been developed as an effective FP measure for our SUs during detention operations. The principles of the TTP remain sound, as does its efficacy. And although I've forgotten to highlight it, can we simply look 2 lines further down with the sentence beginning a return? A return to the original TTP format should address many of the concerns and issues that have arisen in recent months. In January 2018, as part of the RMP investigation into the DDOs, N1192, who was one of the call sign commanders of the subunit, gave a statement on the 31st of January of 2019. In the course of that statement, he informed the officers who were speaking to him that during the course of his deployment, he had killed 35 people. He was unable to recall the particular operation he was being asked about, and that was in fact Objective Tyburn, which I've already covered. But he did recall the one that we are now dealing with, Objective 9. And what he said was this: "The only occasion which sticks in my memory is Objective 9. I can account for my actions, if required, at a later date, but I do recall Objective 9 was my DDO. From what I can remember, I killed one of the enemy." Those were the only details he was able to recall. Objective 9 came within the remit of the investigation by Operation Northmoor. However, no further statements were taken from members of the UK Special Forces about this incident. The inquiry will review the available evidence with care and consider not only what happened on the night that 7 Afghan males were killed, but also whether those killings were covered up and whether a proper investigation was carried out by the Royal Military Police. Can I turn to deal, please, with the 6th example of the 7 that I propose to touch upon? The 6th example, known as Objective 1, also has the title Operation Sestro, and the reasons for that will become clear a little later on. This DDO dates back to the 18th of October of 2012 and engages a number of the terms of reference. The core participants, Mr. Akhtar Norzai and Ms. Shapir Norzai, claim to have lost relatives as a consequence of alleged unlawful activity by British armed forces during the DDO. There were concerns expressed about this DDO within the armed forces. The DDO was examined in the BBC Panorama programme of July 2022, and the DDO was investigated by the RMP under the title name Operation Sestro. On the 18th of October of 2012, a UK Special Forces subunit commanded by Soldier A conducted a nighttime DDO in the village of Loiba near Nadali in central Helmand. The target of that operation was a suspected Taliban commander, Faisal Mohammed, and for these purposes he was given the objective name Number 1. According to the intelligence that had been provided, he was linked to the emplacement of IEDs and planned VBIED attacks, and his removal would disrupt the planned VBIED threat and reduce the ability of senior commanders to conduct operations in the area. Within the documentation that I wanted to refer to, could I please ask that we turn to document 33, and within it, please, to page 3. Page 3 contains part of the information set out in the FIR, the First Impression Report. And what is recorded here is that Faisal's removal would further reduce the ability of senior commanders to conduct operations in the transitioned area of Nad-e-Ali. During the course of the DDO, 4 individuals were killed. Faisal Mohammed, who was 18 years old and is described by his family as a farmer. Naik Mohammed, who was 16 years old and is also described by his family as a farmer. Ahmed Shah, who was 12 years of age, and Mohammed Tayeb, who was 14. According to the available evidence from the subunits, and in particular from soldiers A and B, as well as from the supporting documentation, the following picture of what took place emerges. The subunit entered the compound in company with the Afghan partner unit, and the APU conducted the Afghan-led call-out. They spoke to the owner of the compound and then approached a second compound where a further Afghan-led call-out was conducted. The subunit entered that compound and 4 males were observed in the corner of the room armed with long-barrelled weapons. The subunit engaged and shot 4 males. The shots were discharged, one by a UK Special Forces soldier and the others by 2 members of the Afghan partner unit, all 3 discharging their weapons in the room. Can we look, please, to, if I've given the reference right, would you bear with me a moment? I think I've got the wrong reference. Can we please go back to the document that we had open a moment ago, which is 975, And can we turn within it, please, to page 4? If we look to the bottom of the page, we can see a section headed Conduct of the Operation. And if we look to the first paragraph, and I've mistakenly not highlighted this, and I'm sorry, but what we can see is that the SU moved to the target area, followed by an Afghan-led call-out and compound clearance. After initial compound was cleared, a further call-out was conducted in respect of a second compound suspected of being used as an insurgent bed-down location. What was then commenced was the clearance of the second compound, entering a guest house within. As soon as it was entered, the dimly lit room, 4 military-aged males were identified, and it was suspected they were insurgents. The 4 males were in close proximity to each other at the end of the small room. Despite the call-out conducted by the Afghan security forces, the 4 males made sudden movements, and when the premises were entered, long-barrelled weapons were seen to be in the possession of some of the group, and an imminent threat to life was perceived. Those 4 males were engaged with aimed single shots. The firers were 2 of M1 and 1 British mentor. That's 2 members of the Afghan partner unit and 1 member of the UK Special Forces subunit. And the engagement, as described, resulted in 4 EKIA. And if we look just to the next few sentences beneath, during the subsequent search of the males and the room, a loaded PKM with 50 rounds in a belt and an AK variant assault rifle made ready with a magazine fitted and a chest rig were found. As part of the SSE, those weapons were recovered, and using the information from the SSE and other documentation, we have done the same as before, namely put together a slide presentation to show some of the information that lay behind the DDO and also what took place when it was carried out that evening. If we look, please, to example 6 among the DDOs, Objective 1, known as Sestro because of the operation name that led to its investigation. It is, of course, a DDO from the 18th of October of 2012. We've identified the name of the core participant family, as well as the fact that it featured in the BBC Panorama programme. On to page 2 and to the maps that we've seen before. We've identified the location which lies to the west of Kandahar, and we can see that when we look at the zoomed in page, we're very close to Lashkargah, somewhere between Gereshk and Lashkargah. As to the details of the operation itself, some of which I've just taken you through, can we turn to the next page, please? As before, we've identified the various details within the original material that describe the circumstances that led to the fatal shooting of individuals during the course of that DDO. And you see what we've identified first on the left-hand side, the Afghan-led compound clearance, and the fact that 4 military-age males were located in the guest house and engaged in self-defence card alpha, and that 1 PKM, a chest rig and an AK variant were recovered from the enemy dead. And then to the right-hand side, the further detail regarding the EKIA, you can see there, after initial compound was cleared, a further call-out was conducted in respect of a second compound suspected of being used as an insurgent bed-down location. And then it gives exactly the same details that I have already taken you through, sir. I'm not proposing to deal with those again, since we've looked at the documentation. Can we turn over the page to deal with the SSE first of all? As a result of the search and the sensitive site exploitation, we know, of course, that 4 people had been fatally shot. 1 PKM, 1 AK-47 and a chest rig were recovered, and we can see all 3 items in the photograph you have slightly to the right of the middle of the page that we're now looking at. The PKM to the top, the AK-47 variant to the middle left, and then the chest rig, which one can see bearing a slight camouflage pattern towards the bottom of the photograph. And before we turn to the next slide, again repeating that we are about to look at images of the deceased, and they are done because of the importance of identifying where the bodies were. So please can we turn to the next slide. We see to the left bodies lying apparently side by side close to one of the side walls, and in particular one of the deceased identified there with the name tag around the neck. We can see the face of what appears to be a young man. It's difficult to see age at this distance and from that quality of photograph, but certainly no apparent facial hair or beard upon him. Thanks very much. The contemporaneous documents which I have already taken you through make clear that lethal force was said to have been used in self-defence. In other words, I repeat as I've done before, that the deceased were shot and killed because they posed an immediate threat to the lives of one or more members, either of the UK Special Forces or of the Afghan partner unit who were present. And the documents make clear that everything that was done in accordance with the rules of engagement and the applicable law of armed conflict. The inquiry will consider these accounts with care and will compare those accounts with the accounts that have been provided by the relatives of the deceased. When the Chief of Staff at the UK Special Forces headquarters in Afghanistan reviewed the OPSUM and the storyboard, he concluded as follows. If we look, please, to document 33 and back to page 6 for a moment, we see the Chief of Staff's comments appearing towards the bottom of that page. Having reviewed the OPSUM and storyboard both immediately after the operation and subsequently, I find no evidence to suggest that there has been a breach of the rules of engagement or conduct in any way. The force used was proportionate and justified with the threat that was presented on target. However, both the OPSUM and the storyboard that the Chief of Staff had reviewed, and both of which were signed off by Soldier A, were inaccurate in respect to potentially important details. It had been recorded that the engagement with the deceased had been a return of fire and that the fatal shots had been discharged by the Afghan soldiers. What had been written was Afghan-led call-out and compound clearance. Upon entering the compound, APU engaged by SAF, in other words, the APU engaged by small arms fire. 4 military-age males located, engaged in a guest house under card Alpha. After clearing room, 1 PKM, 1 AK variant, and 1 chest rig were recovered from the enemy dead. Neither the assertion that they had been engaged with small arms fire, nor that it was the APU who had killed everyone within that room was correct. The family refute any claims that their relatives were armed or in any way linked to the insurgency. They insist that each of the deceased was an innocent civilian and that they had nothing to do with the Taliban and that there were no weapons in the compound. None of the family members who have provided statements in the judicial review proceedings saw what happened when the 4 deceased were shot. However, Akhtar Norzai, the brother of Faisal Mohammed and Naik Mohammed, was detained in another compound, and in his statement he describes having been restrained, hooded, beaten and interrogated. And the widow of Faisal Mohammed, Ms. Shapir Norzai, states that she saw Akhtar Norzai being assaulted in the way he described. Complaints were raised by the family and large numbers of local residents planned to demonstrate in Lashkar. The National Directorate of Security and representatives from the Governor's Office attended the compound to investigate and took photographs of where it was that the deceased had been killed. According to the statement of Noor Mohammed Nourzai, Afghan officials told the family that the deceased had been shot by mistake. However, according to the OPSUM, the Afghan officials concluded that the engagements were lawful and there was no case to be answered. An expert in the forensic examination of firearms has considered the statements and the photographs and reached the following conclusion about the scene. The circular marks in the walls are not consistent in position with having been caused in the manner described in Noor Mohammed Nourzai's statement. The circular damage areas are located close to the floor level. The low-level damage would have struck the lower abdomen of an average-sized man in a sitting position on the floor. From observing the photographs of the deceased young Afghan males, the majority of the wounds which are visible are located either to the head or chest, therefore not consistent in position with the circular wall markings. The family contacted Public Interest Lawyers Limited, who sent correspondence to the Ministry of Defence in December 2012, indicating an intention to bring proceedings in respect of the alleged unprovoked attack. In the same month, an article was published in the Guardian newspaper reporting that the Secretary of State for Defence had been asked to launch an urgent inquiry into claims that British forces led a counterinsurgency operation in Afghanistan in which a 12-year-old boy and 3 teenagers were shot dead while they were drinking tea. The article also reported that lawyers acting for a brother of the 2 victims had written to the Defence Secretary and quoted directly from that letter. In light of the pre-action protocol, SIB investigators were immediately deployed to identify the personnel involved and recover the relevant records. Further accounts were taken by the SIB from those members of the subunit involved. Soldier A was interviewed under caution on the 8th of December 2012, and a witness statement written up from the detail of the account he provided in the interview. Soldier A confirmed that his role was to command a mentoring team of the APU, that he had helped plan the operation, and that the brief was to arrest Objective 1. He said that after the APU call-out, the males who had come out said that Objective 1 lived in another compound and directed them to that. He denied that anyone was ill-treated. At the second compound, Soldier A said there was no reaction to the APU-led call-out. The lead arrest team entered, and the males were separated from the women and children, and he described the males as having been blindfolded and, as he put it, fabric-cuffed. The remaining teams then set about clearing the outer compounds. Soldier A described that as he was finishing clearing the centre building, he heard shots fired. Initial shots were AK-47, and Soldier A thought it was his team being fired at. He then said that Soldier B informed him that they had encountered armed males inside and that they had been shot and killed. Soldier A saw the bodies being moved by the APU in order to search underneath them, and he saw 2 long-barrelled weapons in the room. At no point during the tactical questioning were any of the detained persons ill-treated, said Soldier A. It transpired that Soldier A had written a first impression report in December 2012 that provided more detail than had been given before. Can we turn to look, please, at document 33, and within that particular document to page 4. And I remind you again of the section that I'd read before when we concerned the conduct of the operation. It describes the clearance of the second compound and entering the guest house within it, and that as soon as the SU entered the dimly lit room, They identified 4 military-age males who they suspected were insurgents, the 4 males in close proximity to each other at the end of the small room. But the 4 males made sudden movements, that long-barrelled weapons were seen to be in the possession of some of that group, and that due to an imminent threat to life being perceived, those 4 males were engaged with aimed single shots, and the fires were 2 members of the APU and 1 from the UK Special Forces sub-unit. Soldier A was interviewed again under caution on the 10th of October 2013, almost a year later. He stated that he did not consider it relevant to set out in the storyboard the identity or the nationality of those persons who had discharged their weapons. In other words, he didn't seek to distinguish between members of the subunit and members of the APU. He said that the document that he'd compiled only needed to include basic facts. He said that when he reviewed the storyboard, he had not yet discussed the operation with Soldier B, and he considered that he might have assumed the team had been fired upon first. He stated that the OPSUM was required to provide more detail, but not the identity or nationality of the persons who had opened fire. He said that at the time of completing the OPSUM, he had still not spoken with Soldier B. He was aware of the investigation, but understood that it had been concluded that any complaints about the operation were unfounded, and he was not aware that those killed were alleged to be children or civilians. He stated that once the lawyers had passed their complaint to the Ministry of Defence, it was then he was asked to compile a first impression report. He said that this document needed to contain more detail, including, this time, the identity or nationality of the persons who had opened fire. He said that he discussed the operation in detail with Soldier B before compiling the first impressions report, which was how he was able to include the details of Soldier B's account of the events and why the first impressions report differed from either the storyboard or the OPSUM. Soldier B was interviewed under caution on the 27th of February 2012. He confirmed that he had entered the guest house in the second compound. He said that on entering the room, he could see 2 people who had firearms who were kneeling down beside a window. He immediately engaged them with numerous aimed shots. He described that someone entered the room behind him, and he could see movement of 2 other individuals in the room. Soldier B said that he engaged one of those and possibly the other, but the people who had come in the room behind him, namely members of the APU, had also fired at the other 2 people in the room. This particular DDO was investigated by the Royal Military Police under the title Operation Sestro. They concluded the evidential sufficiency test was met, and they referred the case to the Service Prosecuting Authority. However, the SPA concluded the full code test was not met, and no prosecutions were brought. The inquiry will review all of the available evidence with care and consider what happened on the night that 4 Afghan males were killed. We will consider what information was recorded about the operation in its immediate aftermath and what should or could have been done to investigate more fully the investigations that were made at the time of the DDO, as well as in the months that followed. Can I deal with the last of the 7 examples before that might be a moment for a short break? The 7th example dates back to the 7th of August of 2012. This particular DDO has the potential to engage a number of the terms of reference. First, the core participants, Mr. Manzoor Aziz, Mr. Mohammed Lal, and Mr. Mohammed Mohammed, all claim to have lost relatives as a consequence of the alleged unlawful activity by British armed forces during this detention operation. And this particular DDO also featured in a BBC article published in December 2022, in which allegations of unlawful activity by UK Special Forces were made. On the 7th of August of 2012, a UK Special Forces subunit commanded by N6717 conducted a nighttime DDO in the village of Shesh Abba in the Nimroz province in southern Afghanistan. The details of that operation have not yet been disclosed into open, but some of the facts can be gleaned from the core participant application made on behalf of one of the Afghan family members, Manzoor Aziz. During the course of the operation, 2 individuals were killed and 2 children were wounded. Hussein Uzbakhai, who is the brother of Mansour Aziz, Ruhia Mullah Mohammed Khalim, who is the sister-in-law of Mansour Aziz, were both killed. Imran Uzbakhai and Bilal Uzbakhai, the infant nephews of Mansour Aziz, were both shot and injured. As described in the core participant application on behalf of Mansour Aziz, Hossein Uzbakhai and his wife Ruqya and their 2 children, Imran and Bilal, are alleged to have been shot whilst asleep in their beds. Mansour Aziz was not present at the time of the DDO, but returns to the address on hearing what had happened. Upon arrival, he found the bodies of his brother and his sister-in-law, but his nephews were missing. It transpired that they had been evacuated to a military facility in order to be treated for the gunshot wounds that they had sustained. Mansour Aziz also discovered that his neighbour's compound had also been raided and that 2 males said to have been of fighting age had been shot and killed. As I've just said, the contemporaneous supporting documentation for this deliberate detention operation has not yet been released into open. Therefore, there's nothing that I can say about the intelligence that led to the raid, the recorded actions by the subunit on the ground, or the content of any report that is said to reflect what happened. As soon as that is available, the inquiry will ensure that it is provided to the core participants. But despite the absence of any details at this stage, it is nevertheless right that I record the inquiry's very real concern that young children were injured as a result of any action by members of UK Special Forces. And furthermore, to confirm that this is a DDO which will be scrutinised so that those affected by the terrible events of that night can understand why this happened to their loved ones. The DDOs that I've described over the last hour or two are 7 incidents that are simply illustrative of a much wider selection of DDOs that the inquiry will be conducting an in-depth analysis of. The inquiry will review and assess all of the evidence, no matter where it comes from. The inquiry will need to compare and contrast the accounts that are, at present, diametrically opposed in order to find where the truth may lie. And the inquiry will need to distinguish rumour and speculation from credible information. What matters, sir, is your assessment of the evidence, and only after all the evidence has been gathered, reviewed and called will it be possible for you to reach any conclusion about the actions of the UK Special Forces subunits and the allegations that have been made against them. That concludes the 7 DDOs that I had wanted to outline to you and the steps the inquiry will be taking to review them. Would that be a convenient moment for a short break before I turn to deal with some of the investigations into the concerns and complaints that have been conducted?
It would. 3:10, please. Thank you.
May it please you, sir. Turning to deal with the next chapter of the opening statement, this concerns the investigations into the concerns and complaints, and first dealing with the evidence of contemporaneous concerns and complaints. As has already been set out when dealing with some of the DDOs that fall to be considered, concerns were raised internally at the time of the operations. Those concerns ranged from the appropriateness of the TTP to changes in insurgent tactics to unlawful activity and extrajudicial killings by UK Special Forces. The issue began to receive particular attention in the early part of 2011. There were discussions among senior officers in UK Special Forces about what, if anything, should be done. N1466, who is the Assistant Chief of Staff Operations at the UK Special Forces headquarters, set out the details of the concerns that he had and the action that those concerns had prompted in a statement that he gave to the Royal Military Police as part of Operation Northmoor. Part of his role was responsibility for oversight of all UK SF operations at home and overseas. As a result, he had access to the post-operational reports, including the sync reps, the SIRs, and the storyboards. In February 2011, his concern over what he called the disproportionate number of EKIA versus the number of weapons recovered was such that he had a conversation with the commander of UK Special Forces N1802. N1802 told him to establish what was going on. Therefore, he duly continued to review the post-incident reporting and, in particular, the numbers of EKIA compared to the number of weapons recovered. He formed the opinion that the numbers were disproportionate, which just increased my concern that things were out of control. In late March 2011, N1466 attended a social function where he had a conversation with the commanding officer of UKAF3, N1785. N1785 raised his concerns about recent DDOs and queried whether it was possible that a deliberate policy was being demonstrated where all fighting-aged males in a given scenario were killed, irrespective of whether they posed a threat or not. It transpired that N1785 had had a conversation with N1799, during which N1799 had said that he had received disturbing information which he believed could have a detrimental effect on the possible reputation of the UK Special Forces. N1799 refused to provide a witness statement to the RMP about the opinion that he had shared with his colleagues. Not only did N1799 speak to N1785, he also spoke to the Chief of Staff of UKAF3, N2349, and he told him of his concerns. According to N2349, N1799 told him that members of Subunit 1, whilst serving in Afghanistan, had been indiscriminately killing people on targets that they were striking. They would kill all males on target, whether they posed a threat or not. N2349 reported this conversation to N1785, who advised him that he would take the matter further up the chain of command. N1785 directed N1799 to provide a written statement documenting what he had been told. Accordingly, on the 24th of March of 2011, N1799 wrote a document setting out the following information. Can I please invite document 35 to be brought up on the screen, and can we turn within that document to look to page 5. We'll need to turn the page on its side and probably zoom in to make it legible to anyone in the room. During conversation with a soldier from Subunit 1A, he stated that it was standard procedure to deploy regularly to hit low and medium value targets in the Helmand area. During these operations, it was said that all fighting age males are killed on target, regardless of the threat they posed. This included those not holding weapons. It was also indicated that fighting age males were being executed on target inside compounds using a variety of methods after they'd been restrained. In one case, it was mentioned that a pillow was put over the head of an individual before being killed with a pistol. It was implied that photos would be taken of the deceased alongside weapons that the fighting age male may not have had in their possession when they were killed. The conversation implied that the intention of regular operations was to pacify areas in Helmand by destroying all the medium and low-level Taliban command chain and facilitators using any means possible. Given the seriousness of what he had been told, on the 5th of April of 2011, N1785 decided to write to N1802. Can we turn please to document 36, and within that document to page 4. The document was written, as I've said, on the 5th of April. One can see the date in the top left. Addressed to N1802, the then commander of UK Special Forces. It's entitled Allegations of EJK by UKAF. In other words, allegations of extrajudicial killing by UK Special Forces. My apologies for not raising this with you during my leaving call, but I was still formulating my thoughts and our truncated meeting didn't seem the right moment. I have, for some time, been aware of rumours within the UKAF3 that UKAF1 subunits have been conducting summary executions of supposed Taliban affiliates on target in Afghanistan. Until very recently, I have not reported this any further and cautioned my team against peddling malicious speculation. However, I have now been given more information of a nature which makes me seriously concerned for the reputation of UK Special Forces. One of my team, an officer, has been told by an individual from UKAF1 that there is, in effect, an unofficial policy amongst the UKAF1 subunits to kill, wherever possible, fighting age males on target, regardless of the immediate threat they pose to our troops. In some instances, this has involved the deliberate killing of individuals after they have been restrained by the subunit, and the subsequent fabrication of evidence to suggest that a lawful killing in self-defence. What I have been told does not amount to anything as substantial as evidence, but to my sense, it is more than just what had been, until recently, vacuous rumour. But if UK Special Forces individuals are conducting extrajudicial killings, then the implications are clearly stark. Notwithstanding this, I feel most strongly that thorough, appropriate investigation is warranted. In the statement that he gave to the Royal Military Police, N1785 described how N1802 had been unhappy about the nature of the information he had been given. Thus it was that N1785 placed the letter he had received from 1799 into the safe within the commanding officer's office at UKAF3, and he also briefed his successor, N2224 about the existence of the letter and gave him a hard copy of the note I have just read out to you, which had been sent to N1802. N1803, Assistant Chief of Staff of Policy based at the UK Special Forces headquarters, who was responsible for advising on all matters of policy regarding UK SF operations, and who was also responsible for ensuring that they were in accordance with government policy, provided a statement to Northmour. As part of his role, N1803 had access to the routine reporting of operations and regularly read those documents. N1803 gave a statement in which he explained the concerns about the TTP, which involved the subunit taking an adult male detainee back into the compound from which he had come. N1803 asked questions about that particular TTP because of the United Kingdom's responsibility to detainees. N1803 spoke to N1788 and also with N1466. N1803 provided a second statement to the RMP under the Northmour investigation, which details a conversation he had with N2108, in which he had raised the question that the TTP might fall outside the remit of the rules of engagement. N1803 thought action should be taken to avoid similar circumstances reoccurring, and so, when similar incidents occurred, N1803 had further conversations with both N1788 and N1466. After a conversation with N1466 in his office, N1803 believes N1466 spoke to N1802 and was then asked by N1802 to conduct a review of the TTP. Whilst N1803 could not remember the dates of any of the conversations that were had, it is possible to provide a temporal fix from an email that he sent to various individuals at UK Special Forces headquarters on the 4th of April 2011 regarding a DTO that I've already taken you to before, but can we turn for completeness to document 37 and to page 2, please? He was the author of the email that I referred to previously, which read, for the first time for a while, I've seen the ask a Bree to go back in to help clear and end up killing him routine. On the 7th of April, N1466 sent an email to N1802, which described the concerns that had been raised with him by N1785. Can we turn, please, to document 38, and within that to pages 9 and 10, please? If we can zoom in and we'll look, please, rather than all of the text, simply at those passages I've highlighted. N1466 described that there was possibly a deliberate policy among the current subunit to engage and kill fighting-age males on target even when they did not pose a threat. He then went on to explain that N1785 is sure that his troops are accurately reporting what they are hearing from colleagues. And he then said clearly, if there is anything more than rumour behind it, then elements of the UK Special Forces have strayed into indefensible ethical and legal behaviour. He continues over the page with the concluding remarks. My instinct is that this merits deeper investigation, hopefully to put minds at rest, including the APU, and to make a clear statement to the UK Special Forces, or at worst case, to put a stop to criminal behaviour. N2108 who was responsible for the provision of legal advice, both operational and non-operational, to UK Special Forces, was aware of the concerns being raised around this time. On the 7th of April, he sent an email to the SO2 Legal at the UK Special Forces headquarters. That email reiterated the obligation upon a commanding officer to report matters to the service police, indicating that the bar was, as he described it, pretty low, since it arose where an offence may have been committed. Can we turn to look, please, at document 39, and within it to pages 2 and 3. Having set out the law that I've just referred to, namely the Armed Forces Act 2006, and in particular section 113, can we look, please, to the section which is described as assessment? In these cases, it is arguable that taken in isolation, each operation does not meet the statutory criteria for notifying the service police. Indeed, it is notable that SIRs, an internal exercise which is partly used as an aid to the CO to determine whether a service offence may have been committed, have been carried out in a couple of the cases, and he refers to Objective 3 and Objective 1. In both, following legal advice being given to Command HQA, it was assessed that the matters did not require reporting to the service police. However, it is arguable that when all these cases are taken together and there is an identification of similar trends and suspicion developing over the credibility of the accounts given in the op sums, then the circumstances are such that a reasonable person would consider that service offences may have been committed. My assessment, based on the op sums and the SIRs prepared to date, indicates that there is at least a requirement to look very carefully at the current TTP of sending males back into compounds to remove weapons or threats. The number of similar incidents may indicate the TTP is a systemic failing. If the TTP was being employed deliberately to generate a certain outcome to justify an engagement under the rules of engagement, then this would suggest service offences may have been committed. In light of the various concerns that had been circulating, N1466 tasked N1788 to conduct a review of what was taking place. N1788 was suitably qualified to do so, since he was responsible for the daily management of all issues relating to UK Special Forces operations in a campaigning context. He also had access to all the reporting documentation in respect to the DDOs, and had been the officer commanding an SU-1 on a previous tour, although this latter aspect did have the potential for an objective impression of conflict to arise. N1788 sought the assistance of N2444 in this regard to look at recent operations to see if there were any anomalies, such as enemy being killed following a compound being secured, and whether there was an abnormal ratio of EKIA to weapons recovered. In due course, N2444 was to tell the RMP investigators under Operation Northmoor that when looked at individually, these operations do not stand out. It is when they are viewed collectively that patterns can be seen, and my suspicion that the TTP was being abused comes to light. The selected deliberate detention operations were put onto a spreadsheet, and N1788 duly reviewed the supporting paperwork for 11 incidents, and he determined that the TTP was inefficient, since having secured the target location and the personnel on site, the subunit then allowed a situation to develop whereby the occupants were able to pose a threat, and this action resulted in kinetic activity by the subunit in situ as they used lethal force to defend themselves. On the 8th of April, N1788 provided his findings to N1466 in an email entitled Subunit 1 Stats. And this covered a 4-month period from the start of December 2010 and the 11 DDOs which he had reviewed. Can we please look at document 40 and within that document to page 3? There are 11 separate incidents spanning 9 discrete operations in which the TTP of sending a Bravo back into a building to assist with clearing it resulted in that same Bravo getting killed. On 8 occasions, the number of EKIA exceeded the number of detainees taken, and there are 6 separate incidents in which the number of EKIA exceeded the number of weapons officially found on target. The 11 DDOs that he had reviewed had resulted in the deaths of 43 Afghan males and the recovery of 26 weapons. N1466 was of the opinion that there were clear examples of questionable conduct by members of UK Special Forces, and that it would be for N1802 to direct what the response should be. N1802 immediately directed that a review of the compound call-out TTP be carried out, and N1788 was sent to Afghanistan to assist N1786 in conducting this. N1786, however, did not provide a witness statement to the RMP investigators. N1466 was to tell the RMP that some of the accounts provided by members of the subunit were implausible, and in hindsight I should have made it clear to N1802 that the issue should be taken to the service police. When considering the alleged use of grenades by insurgents who had armed themselves after being sent back into the compound, N1466 told the RMP the Taliban seemed to have ceased in general fighting against helicopter assaults from the compounds. Their reasoning seemed to be that most suspects were released from custody after 96 hours of detention. Under these circumstances, surrender was a better outcome than fighting against overwhelming odds. I would question why, having reached this conclusion, they then initiated contact post-surrender. During clearance, the Afghan males will be accompanied by members of the subunit with weapons trained on them throughout. The chances of successful contact under such circumstances would be extremely slim, especially so if using a grenade. The delay in activating a grenade and waiting for it to go off would render it almost certainly ineffective when abundant cover is nearby. The individual looking to employ the grenade would almost certainly be killed before it became effective. The use of a grenade seemed particularly odd in these circumstances in a country where small arms are abundant. Small arms would give a more instant effect against subunit members and be less pointless from an aggressive viewpoint. And given the layers of implausibilities above, the aggregate coincidence of such events on multiple targets seemed especially surprising and logic-defying. When reviewing the photographs of the EKIA, he told the RMP investigators that some of the aspects seemed odd. The layout and attitude of some of the bodies. By this I mean the position of the bodies, such as where a body has a blanket over it, for example, or where hands are crossed over the chest. The scarcity of weapons in many of the scenes and the position of the weapons. By this I mean where a weapon is laid down parallel to the body. The high numbers of EKIA in a single room when a helicopter would give ample time to disperse and take up fire positions. The number of headshots. The number of cases in which EKIA are found in male accommodation rooms and not elsewhere around the compound. And finally, the presence of an individual in a male sleeping quarter who had allegedly emerged from a doorway to engage troops. Plainly, the inquiry will consider these observations with care and assess whether the documentation that he reviewed supports the opinion that N1466 reached, or whether there is or might be alternative explanations for this or any of the other evidence that might be received. The TTP review, as has been heralded in some of the documents that I have referred you to, is a review into the tactics, techniques and procedures that was conducted. The terms of reference for that particular review set out the particular TTP in use and noted, amongst other things, that having the head male re-enter the compound ahead of the assault force is intended to protect the subunit during the clearance phase. Can we turn, please, to look to document 41, and within that document, please, to page 11. The document is dated the 8th of April and concerns the terms of reference for the review of TTPs. And as you'll see, as what I've just read out, having the head male re-enter the compound ahead of the assault force is intended to protect the subunit during the clearance phase. And then to the next paragraph down, between December 10 and April 11, there have been several instances in which the subunits have been forced to engage and kill the nominated Afghan male, either as the individual returned into the compound or during the clearance phase, because he had reached for a concealed weapon. The TTP may no longer be appropriate in that it offers the insurgent an opportunity to arm himself. There are an increasing number of families, tribes who may perceive that their male heads have been killed whilst in subunit custody, having surrendered. This is likely to harm the perception of ISAF government force legitimacy and increase the challenges of district-level reintegration. There is a sense among members of the Afghan APU that subunit can be overly kinetic during the clearance phase of detention operations. In several instances, the APU has refused to accompany the subunit on any further operations. This threatens the relationship between UKSF, Her Majesty's government, and the APU, and if allowed to deteriorate, could undermine UK Special Forces transition plans in Afghanistan. N1788 and N1786 were tasked to carry out the following. And within the same document, can we please turn on a page? At paragraph 5, you are to examine the following. Has there indeed been a change in the reaction by insurgents to this TTP? If so, what is the likely driver for their modified behaviour? Is the TTP still appropriate to provide protection to the subunit? If so, could it be modified to reduce the probability of the male heads of household taking action that results in them being engaged and killed? What is the nature, severity of the APU concerns, and will a modified TTP address it? Should the APU be used to observe or follow up the Afghan male, reducing the potential for tension between UK Special Forces, the APU, the Afghan locals and the government? Is it necessary for Afghan male heads of household to be involved in the subsequent searching process after they have opened fields of view? If so, should they be restrained. It will be immediately obvious that the terms of reference were forward-looking rather than requiring any investigation of the actual operations that had been carried out. Thus, the review was predicated on the assumption that the force used was lawful. The report that N1788 was to provide was to include, if we look to paragraph 6, an assessment of the developing insurgent reaction to this TTP, a judgment as to the continued suitability of the TTP. Does it successfully balance protection of the force against the aim of effecting detention of Taliban suspects? Any recommendation to modify the TTP which might reduce the operational risks at para 3 above, and an assessment of the severity of APU concerns and how these might be addressed. The final draft of the terms of reference was signed off on the 11th of April of 2011 and required the review to be concluded by the 20th of April 2011. N1788 exchanged emails with N17866 in the run-up to his departure. N1788 made it clear that the review was to consider the efficacy of the TTP and the insurgent reaction and exploitation. And N1786 stated that he would not notify the staff in theatre until he had received the terms of reference. N1788 flew out to Afghanistan on the 14th of April, and he was accompanied on that flight by N1141, the commanding officer of the very unit whose TTP he was being asked to review. N1788 saw this as appropriate, since he regarded N1141 as his main point of contact for the review. When N1788 spoke with him about the TTP, N1141 made it clear that he believed he had no concerns with the TTP being used and was unaware that there was a potential problem with its employment. N1141 said the TTP had been developed over time to minimise the risk to personnel. According to N1788, N1141 was surprised when it was pointed out that there was a professional and presentational issue with a scenario in which, having gained control of the target premises and its associated personnel, one subsequently lost that control to the point where the previously detained insurgent could pose a threat. During his time in theatre, N1788 also spoke with the call sign commanders who agreed with the opinion of N1141. They voiced their concern over the poor performance of the APU, and they thought the subunits were doing a good job and that their TTPs were appropriate. N1788 drafted his report whilst he was in Afghanistan and delivered it in due course to N1786, who agreed with the findings and recommendations. In short, the review found that the reason some of the recent DDOs had become kinetic might be a deliberate insurgent response to the TTP to force such an outcome. Among the recommendations, the following are perhaps of note. Can we look, please, to document 32, and within it to pages 5 and 6. The following actions are invited. The subunit retains the use of the call-out clearance TTP as a valuable and balanced FP measure. The subunit returns to the original configuration of the TTP in order to reduce some of the concerns and risks identified in the course of this review. Potential amendments include 1. tactical positioning of APU personnel to ensure sight of subunit actions at all times, where this is practical and does not put the subunit at greater tactical risk. 2, using Afghan partner unit personnel where appropriate to control and, if necessary, accompany the detained Bravo selected to re-enter the compound. 4, refraining from using Bravos to assist in the searching of the compound unless there is a compelling reason to do so. And 6, ensuring the Bravo selected for re-entry into the compound is correctly restrained, that is plastic cuffed, to reduce his ability to handle weapons or devices. The review was careful not to offer any opinion as to the propriety of any of the operations that had been reviewed, and it was also careful not to reach any conclusion about the kinetic outcome that had attracted so much criticism. Nevertheless, it recognised that the TTP, as currently deployed, needed to be modified and greater control was required over any male from the compound who was to go back into the building or to assist with a search. The inquiry will consider with care whether the TTP review presents a wasted opportunity to investigate thoroughly and properly the concerns of potentially unlawful activity of which the chain of command was already aware. The inquiry will consider with care whether the findings withstand rigorous analysis or whether the accounts of those involved were too readily accepted. And the inquiry will consider with care whether the recognition that the TTP was not working was sufficiently robust for the dangers to be understood. On the 28th of April of 2011, N1802, having considered the review, responded to the findings in 2 letters sent to the subunit. Can we turn, please, in document 43 to look at pages 4 and 5. In the first of those letters, dated the 28th of April, he wrote, "I am content for the compound clearance TTP as it was originally devised to continue to be employed as required. I recognise that it is a valid and effective FP measure that reduces tactical risk for our soldiers on target, but its corruption can have seriously deleterious and unintended consequences. I will caveat my endorsement of the TTP with a reminder that the Bravos selected to re-enter the compound must do so voluntarily and that he does so as one who is in subunit custody." If we scroll down that page a little further, there needs to be a cultural shift in the thinking of the subunits. There needs to be a cultural shift in the thinking of the subunits. Tempo and the pursuit of operational statistics must be tempered with an understanding of long-term effect, care of our strategic relationships, and a consistent wariness of unintended consequences. And then in the second of the 2 letters he wrote, on to the next page, if we may. "Afghan personnel who emerge from the compounds on our instruction and at gunpoint are de facto under subunit custody from that point until allowed to leave our cordon. It is our legal obligation under the law of armed conflict to ensure that they are protected accordingly, which includes preventing situations in which their actions may cause us to employ lethal force. It is therefore imperative that we modify our TTPs, and I endorse the recommended changes. In particular, the return of Afghan males into compounds must be voluntary, and they must be suitably restrained as to prevent the use of longer range weapons." As will be apparent from the timeline of some of the DDOs that has already been outlined, this review might have had an impact upon the practice of using unrestrained males to go back into the compound, and thereby allowing them to pick up weapons and forcing a lethal response from the subunits. But it did not end the kinetic collapse of certain operations that resulted in casualties. Indeed, on the 7th of August 2012, as I have already described, the Norzai family lost 4 relatives who are said to have been aged between 12 and 18. But not only did the kinetic nature of the DDOs continue, there is evidence from the emails that have already been considered to suggest that there was a reluctance for this to be escalated, and that advice to that effect was being provided by the senior legal advisor to UK Special Forces. Can we look, please, to document 44, and within it, please, to page 4. It's a document to which I've already referred, but given the TTP that was the review that was conducted and the conclusions and advice offered, can we just refer again to what N2108 was writing the following month in May of 2011? If we all agree that the aspiration to nip in the bud at the lowest level is sound, then we will need to be prepared to release something a bit more than the usual "it's not true" to head this off. I'm concerned that if this particular complaint gets elevated to a higher level, then we will lose control of it, and our political masters could knee-jerk and apply pressure for a SIB investigation. Can we turn to look at document 45, please, and within that, can we turn to page 3? The same month, to remind you of the briefing note that N2108 had prepared that was sent to UK Special Forces headquarters. The aspiration is to deal with the complaint informally at the lowest level without it being raised unnecessarily to the ISAF level. UK Special Forces headquarters Afghanistan will send the UK Special Forces lawyer in order to provide sufficient detail to rebut the allegation. And then again, to remind you of document 46, please, and within that to page 2. In July 2011, N2108 sent the email to N2272 in which he wrote, "I have spoken to N6881, who has suggested that we respond in terms of the fact that we've reviewed the TTP and are now content with it." And then in August 2011, you'll recall that N2108 provided a potential reply to the international organisation, which informed the reader that the practice they had complained of had been reviewed and that ISAF would soon be issuing a directive aimed at the conduct of night raids. The inquiry will review that advice with care and consider the extent to which this may have affected the decision of those who concluded not to refer any of the DDOs to the service police. The fact that relevant members of the chain of command had the necessary knowledge to refer these incidents might be evident from all that has already been said. However, by May 2011, it would appear that N1802 had concerns about the way in which the in-theatre review process was being conducted. Having reviewed the serious incident review for Objective 1 from February of that year, N1802 exchanged emails with his legal advisor, N2108. Can we look, please, to document 48, please, and first to page 3. I'm slightly surprised that the SIR was conducted by the officer commanding the subunit. I don't recall it being usual that the ground commander investigates the incident. If it is usual, I would like an alternative nominated to conduct such reviews in the future. The witness statements are formulaic and seem, with very minor adjustments, to be derived from a common draft. The reply to those concerns by N2108 is a page up, please. It is customary for the officer commanding the relevant subunit to conduct the overview of the operation, as well as providing his assessment of the actions of the firers on the operation. Indeed, the current guidance stipulates that the relevant officer commanding should be the person who provides this input. I share your concerns about the nature and quality of the witness statements, and it is fair to say that the quality of these varies enormously, but should be managed by the person conducting the review. Where a statement is required, it is pretty much left to the soldier to produce, and I sense there is a culture of cutting and pasting going on. A possible solution could be that the witnesses are separately interviewed by someone, a UK Special Forces lawyer, to negative suggestions of collusion between witnesses and improve the quality of the detail in the statements. Having dealt with concerns that were raised at the time of some of the DDOs that I have described, can I deal very briefly with the investigation into what was termed Operation Sestro, and then that may be a convenient time for today. On the 4th of December of 2012, the Guardian newspaper produced an article alleging that in October of that year, British forces had shot and killed 4 boys in the village of Loibag in Helmand province. And furthermore, the article said that the Defence Secretary had been asked to launch an urgent inquiry. The next day, the 5th of December, the Special Investigation Branch, second in command, emailed the officer commanding the SIB deployment in Afghanistan, 62 Section SIB. And in the email, he asked whether the officer commanding was aware of the allegations that had been made in the newspaper. The officer commanding subsequently recovered the UK Special Forces storyboard from the operation. On the 6th of December, a pre-action protocol letter was received from public interest lawyers by the head of the SIB. On the 7th of December, the Force Provost Marshal in Afghanistan launched an investigation into the allegations, and the officer commanding 62 Section SIB was designated as the senior investigating officer for what was classified as a special investigation. The senior investigating officer set multiple initial actions, which included identifying the UK Special Forces personnel on the operation, recovering operational paperwork, establishing whether there was any video footage of the operation, tracing and interviewing witnesses, requesting copies of the information held by public interest lawyers. And the senior investigating officer also considered visiting the scene and conducting house-to-house inquiries, but noted that the area had now transitioned to Afghan security control. 62 Section SIB commenced the investigation, but it was fraught with complications. Statements were taken from the UK Special Forces personnel on the operation. However, this proved far from straightforward, since the soldiers in question were leaving Afghanistan, and some were interviewed in the airport departure lounge, whilst others were not interviewed for several weeks. The commander of the Afghan partner unit was interviewed, but refused to sign his statement. During attempts to recover potential surveillance footage, it was discovered it had been overwritten and that there was a hard drive error. Neither of the 2 Afghan partner unit soldiers who was said to have discharged their weapons was willing to cooperate with the investigation. Throughout the investigation, relations were strained between the RMP and the then solicitors that represented the families of the deceased public interest lawyers. In 2013, public interest lawyers unsuccessfully sought judicial review of the RMP investigation on a number of grounds, including that the RMP were insufficiently independent and their investigation was ineffective. Until the challenge was resolved, public interest lawyers declined to facilitate interviews with any of the Afghan witnesses with which they were in contact. They also insisted that no Afghan civilian witness should be contacted without prior reference to them, that they must be present when any interviews took place, and that their travel and accommodation expenses should be met. It proved impossible for agreements to be reached on a suitable location or on the terms of any interview. As a result, no Royal Military Police interviews of any Afghan civilian witnesses were carried out. For the next 10 months, up until February 2014, the senior investigating officer attempted to find a solution to obtaining formal evidence from the Afghan civilian witnesses. However, it proved impossible to find a solution that was acceptable both to the SIO and the lawyers acting for the family. The senior investigating officer gave consideration to closing down the investigation, but following receipt of statements from the family members of the deceased, the investigation was reclassified as a murder investigation. On the 14th of February 2014, the member of the UK Special Forces who had fired some of the fatal shots, Soldier B, was re-interviewed after caution and informed he would be referred to the Director of Service Prosecutions. On the 25th of February of the same year, RMP officers travelled to Afghanistan to interview a senior officer of the APU involved in the original incident. Due to the location where the interview was to take place, it was necessary to provide protection for the Royal Military Police team, and this was undertaken by UK Special Forces. The night before the interview, the UK Special Forces legal advisor asked what questions the RMP would be asking of the witness. The RMP declined to answer. The actual interview with the senior APU officer went well. He had an understanding of the case and asked what he could do to help. He agreed to arrange for the RMP to meet another member of the APU, Soldier J, who was a key witness whom the RMP had in fact been told it would not be possible for them to speak to. When Soldier J arrived a short while later, he appeared content to speak to the RMP. When asked, he tried to arrange for the weapons that were used in the incident to be brought to the meeting. He also told the RMP that two of the soldiers who had entered the guest house where the shooting took place, one was now dead and the other had been brain damaged by an IED. This was obviously important information of which the RMP were previously unaware. At this point, however, the meeting was terminated by the officer commanding the UK Special Forces subunit. The view of the RMP officers was that the officer commanding was intimating there was some sort of danger. Therefore, they agreed to finish the meeting before they had covered all the topics they wanted to. It later transpired that the Chief of Staff had ordered the meeting terminated as it had been in breach of agreed conditions. The RMP contend there were no such agreed conditions. It was their view that the interview may have been deliberately sabotaged in an attempt to pervert the course of justice, and they made plans to arrest the Chief of Staff. On the 6th of March, RMP officers attended UK Special Forces headquarters in Afghanistan to make that arrest and seize relevant material. However, on arrival, they learned that the Chief of Staff had returned to the United Kingdom. The RMP later recorded as follows. The commander stated that the Chief of Staff had gone home. However, I'd noted that the Chief of Staff's beret and mobile telephone was still in his pigeonhole in the foyer. The commander left the building for about 15 seconds before re-entering the foyer and then going into the secure ops room area, shutting the door behind him. A few seconds later, he reappeared and introduced the Chief of Staff, stating that he'd been mistaken and that the Chief of Staff was still in the building. Over the next 2 hours, the commander initially physically blocked the RMP's entry to the ops room. UK Special Forces in Afghanistan's legal advisor arrived and was apparently shaking with fury, agitation and nervousness. And the legal advisor complained that he had not been informed in advance and demanded to know the security clearances of the RMP officers. The commander would intermittently come over to voice his displeasure, and at one point he said he was considering having the RMP removed. Subsequently, the locks were changed on the perimeter of the UK Special Forces headquarters in Afghanistan, which had the effect of denying access to the RMP. On the 7th of March, the member of the UK Special Forces who had been the call sign leader, Soldier A, was interviewed and informed he would be referred to his commanding officer. On the 10th of March, the Chief of Staff, who had gone back to the United Kingdom, was arrested and interviewed under caution. In response to questions about the decision to stop the interview with the Afghan partner unit soldier, Soldier J, the Chief of Staff stated that he had done so in order to protect the sacrosanct relationship UK forces had with the Afghan partner unit. On the 10th of April 2014, Soldier B was referred to the Director Service Prosecutions for murder, and on the same date, Soldier A was referred to his commanding officer for misconduct in a public office, negligently performing a duty, and knowingly making a false record. On the 2nd of May 2014, Soldier A was referred to the Director Service Prosecutions for the same offences, and on the 5th of June, the Chief of Staff, known as Soldier C now, was also referred to the Director Service Prosecutions for obstructing the course of public. The Directors took advice from independent prosecuting counsel before concluding that the evidential sufficiency was not met. This decision was challenged under the review scheme, and further advice was obtained, which confirmed that there was insufficient evidence to charge Soldier B, Soldier A, or Soldier C. This will, of course, be a matter into which the inquiry will take careful review. And can I turn in due course now tomorrow to deal with what I want to set out in respect of the wider RMP investigation, which was entitled Operation Northmoor.
Thank you, Mr. Glasgow. We'll adjourn now, please, until 10 o'clock tomorrow morning. Thank you.